Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, post-sanctions Iran is still a hard place to find a job. We'll look at the economic reasons behind unrest in the Middle East's second largest economy. Also this week, Meltdown and Spectre. These are the nicknames for two major flaws discovered in the hardware of nearly every computer and digital device worldwide. The race is on to fix them. Plus, new year, new rules for European finance, but that's not all. We'll ask the chief global economist at UBS, what's his dangerous idea? It is the number 2 economy in the Middle East after Saudi Arabia, and when it comes to population, it's second only to Egypt. Around 80 million people call Iran home, and more than half that number is under 30 years of age. That's why when demonstrations over rising prices and economic mismanagement broke out in the new year, the world paid attention. The demonstrations represent the biggest show of public dissent in the country since rallies took place in 2009. The government, blaming outside interference, temporarily shut down social media like Instagram and Telegram, the online messaging service that's used by 40 million Iranians. So, well, smartphones played an important role in the protests, but the economy did too, as Al Jazeera's Zain Basravi reports from Tehran.
The reasons that they came out onto the streets haven't gone away. That's really the point going forward. And it was down to the economy. The protests started with dissatisfaction over economic problems in the country. The cost of living is rising. Unemployment, especially among young people, is very high. And there were proposals by President Hassan Rouhani's administration of increasing gas prices exponentially. And that was something that was just very unpopular with the people. And even the pro-government supporters that are coming out in large numbers now, it doesn't mean that they necessarily support the president's policies, but they support the governing system in Iran, and they want to push home that point. But they certainly don't necessarily support President Hassan Rouhani, and going forward, his government is going to have to deal with economic issues that remain unaddressed. And no doubt those things will continue to be a thorn in his side. So we may see some adjustments to proposals to raise gas prices and an effort to continue subsidies that keep the cost of living stable, if not bring it down further.
Well, Iranian oil is now back on international markets and GDP is growing after years of recession. But there's unequal distribution of wealth among Iran's regions. Foreign investors are staying away, put off by banking worries. Restrictions are still in place on dollar trades passing through America. And there's a fear that sanctions will be restored. The country ranks 120 out of 190 in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. State-owned enterprises dominate, stifling competition. According to some, the sprawling business empire of the Revolutionary Guards dominates the service industry. There's a rising number of people looking for work. Unemployment officially stands at around 12.5%, but in some parts of the country, it's over 50%. Analysts say that the historic nuclear deal negotiated in 2015 has failed to deliver prosperity, and the protests are fueled by anger at the cost of living and widespread corruption. Well, joining us now from Vienna via Skype is Dr. Bijan Khajehpour. Bijan is an economist and managing partner at Atieh International, a Vienna-based international strategic consulting firm. Good to have you with us on the programme, sir. So, as we heard there, the largest street protests in years in Iran over high prices and economic hardship. As far as you're concerned, what are the main economic drivers of this discontent?
Obviously, you can look at a number of economic phenomena in Iran. I mean, high prices were mentioned, but also unemployment is a key factor. What I would also like to highlight is what economists refer to as underemployment. Iran has a very educated young population, and a lot of these educated citizens are unemployed. We have about 25–26% youth unemployment in Iran. And as far as we can follow at this stage, there is a direct correlation between the level of unemployment, especially youth unemployment, and the protests. So there are definitely a number of factors that are basically leading to disenchantment and discontent among the Iranian population, especially the lower middle class and the lower income class.
OK, what about corruption? Is that an issue that plays into this discontent?
Certainly. I mean, there is a feeling, I would call it as a heading for all of these issues. I would say that the Iranians feel that there is injustice in the country. There is corruption, there is mismanagement, there are rents that various interest groups, including religious institutions, various foundations, have in Iran, while the lower income classes and especially the youth are unemployed and are not catered for. So there is a feeling of injustice, and corruption is definitely one important element in that.
These protests began just days after President Rouhani revealed his 2018 budget bill, having promised more transparency and to crack down on corruption. What can the president do now to maneuver so that he can use these protests, if you like, to his advantage?
Well, you're right. I think one of the grievances is the feeling that a lot of the country's resources are going towards institutions that are not really providing what the Iranian society is asking for, not providing jobs, not providing prestige or development. And the first thing that President Rouhani could do is to try to restructure the allocations. I mean, there are billions of dollars of allocations to various religious institutions, foundations, military organizations that the people feel are uncalled for. And that could be a first step to make these institutions more accountable, make the budget allocations more transparent.
The economy has been improving. That money, though, is not obviously trickling down to the middle classes. What do you think is the outlook economically for Iran this year?
I think the positive growth outlook will be there. I think the Iranian economy has potential to grow. It is relatively inefficient at this stage, I mean, the overall economic activity. And there is a lot of room for growth in various sectors through increased efficiency, through better management, through a pushback against corruption. But you're right. I mean, it takes time for the overall macroeconomic growth to trickle down to various sectors, especially to the provinces, where people feel that they are being neglected and they are not really benefiting from the economic upturn. So the outlook is positive.
And what about foreign investment? How important is that to Iran's economy in the future? International investors, despite the lifting of sanctions, very wary still of putting their money into Iran. How important is foreign direct investment to the country?
Foreign investment is very, very significant, not just because capital will flow into the economy, but also because new technologies and also new management concepts will flow into the country. As I said, mismanagement and inefficiency are issues, and part of those issues can be addressed through efficient foreign investment, through different concepts and knowledge that can be transferred to the country.
Dr. Khajehpour, really good to talk to you. Bijan, many thanks indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Now, a design change made to computer chips over a decade ago inadvertently opened up a way to let hackers into nearly every computer and digital device. The good news is that we now know about the flaw in the hardware. The bad news is that fixing it will slow down your machine. The nicknames given to the bugs found in central processing units, which are essentially the brains of your computer, are Meltdown and Spectre. Rob Reynolds reports.
The world's biggest technology companies are scrambling to fix critical cybersecurity flaws that could compromise every computer, smartphone, and server sold in the past 20 years.
Hackers, if they are able to install some malicious software on a computer and then go the extra step to take advantage of this problem, they can access some really sensitive information, including passwords, encryption keys that let them access even more sensitive data.
Security researchers discovered vulnerabilities in computer chips used in nearly all devices. The flaws, dubbed Spectre and Meltdown by security experts, would allow intruders to steal any data on the systems. Companies involved include Apple, Microsoft, and Google. The flawed chips are made by Intel, ARM, and AMD. Google's Project Zero security team said it found the flaws sometime last year. The company announced details of how it is working to protect users of Google Cloud and Android devices. It says a new version of the Chrome browser debuting later this month will include fixes. Microsoft has also developed an emergency patch that will automatically be applied to all devices running on Windows 10. Apple has not publicly disclosed any fixes for its operating systems. Those patches will address the Meltdown bug, but they could significantly slow down device performance, in some cases by as much as 30%. The other flaw, called Spectre, is harder to fix and will ultimately require a redesign of the chips themselves.
Adrian Mars is a technology journalist and IT consultant. He says security flaws of this scale are rare.
Normally, security researchers go to great efforts to keep them secret. They tell the people who are affected, give them time to produce a software solution, and then we all get to hear about it. In this case, embarrassingly for the chip companies, the information is leaked before the fix is widely available. So that is relatively unusual, but it happens. Certainly, it doesn't usually happen on this huge scale. Security flaws happen every month. We're all used to the updates we get to our devices, and those are mostly about fixing security flaws. What's less common is ones that affect so many devices and that affect the hardware, the physical chips inside the computer, as opposed to the software, the programs. They're fairly easily fixed. But when you get a fix in something that's a physical, actual thing, it's harder to solve. And in this case, it comes with penalties when we fix it with software.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost, the daily money struggles of people in Gaza, told through cartoon characters. Now, New Year's Day 2018 in California marked the first legal recreational use of cannabis. As of this week, adults over 21 can possess up to an ounce, or 28 grams, of the drug and can grow up to 6 marijuana plants at home. Opponents say the law will introduce young people to drug use, but analysts say the pot industry could be worth billions of dollars, certainly in tax revenue over the next few years. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia rolled out value-added tax for the first time to mark the new year. The 5% tax is being applied to most goods and services. Both Gulf states are trying to diversify their economies away from a reliance on oil and gas. And new year, new rule book for European finance. Everything from crowdfunding platforms to big banks are affected. It's known as MiFID II, and it's basically about transparency. The biggest financial trading overhaul since the 2008 global financial crisis demands that trades are reported to a central database. Dealings done away from public eyes in so-called dark pools of liquidity will be recorded and traceable. There's also a requirement that banks pay up for research given free by the big investment institutions, those same institutions that are also selling investment products. And it's now EU law that consumers are given more information on the kinds of risks they're buying into when they invest their money. The impact of climate change is being felt all over the world, especially in low-lying islands. Scientists say that the rising water level is causing Cuba to shrink. Our Latin America editor Lucia Newman reports now from the coastal town of Humanitas near Havana.
Jorge Reyes and his wife Adis have lived by the ocean for nearly 60 years, long enough to notice that something is changing, especially when they look towards the quay in front of them.
40 or even 30 years ago during low tide, you could walk over to the quay over there and you wouldn't get wet. It was totally dry. Now the tide is never lower than this. It's all because of climate change.
My daughter grew up here. We didn't have this wall, and I would lower her down there to play on the rocks because it was dry.
In Humanitas, a coastal town near Havana, everyone notices that the water level is rising on this low-lying island.
It's hard to believe, but I'm actually walking on top of what was a swimming pool some 40 years ago, removed about 30 meters away from a beach that no longer exists. It's yet another undeniable example of how the ocean is eating away at much of Cuba's coastline.
A report prepared by the Ministry of Science, Technology and Environment warns that by 2050, coastal levels will have risen 27 centimeters. And by the end of the century, it will be up by 85 centimeters, causing the island to shrink significantly. Scientists argue that climate change is also provoking more frequent and stronger hurricanes, flooding, and at the same time, prolonged periods of drought inland. The climate experts who prepared the report tell us a major action plan is being implemented to confront this new reality.
We are applying new practices, like planting corals to increase and reproduce coral reefs, and more mangroves, which are key barriers for protecting the coastline. And we need to adopt new construction practices. In the Caribbean, we have experience building on stilts.
The list is long, but scientists concede that inevitably many people will have no other choice but to leave their homes and move inland.
Well, unlike the world of finance, nature doesn't do bailouts, and many senior global economists are warning about a looming ecological credit crunch. The fact is, we're using up limited resources that are fast running out. We may not have much longer before an ecological credit crisis occurs. Ecological debt is defined as the excess consumption of natural resources over and beyond the Earth's capacity to regenerate. Joining us now from Wiltshire in the UK, Paul Donovan. Paul's the Global Chief Economist with UBS. Great to have you with us once again, Paul. So, a revamped version of Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, or MiFID II as it's known, has come into effect this week. The EU's most ambitious yet controversial package of financial reforms. What do you make of it, and what are its benefits?
The aim of MiFID II is to increase transparency in the financial sector, to make investors aware of what it is that they're paying for and what it is that they're not paying for when they do business with financial intermediaries. So in that sense, it's an attempt to try and increase transparency. It has also led to a number of adjustments within the financial sector. For example, research, which was very often bundled up with other brokerage fees, has now had to be separated out and priced, and people are debating about how that happens. But essentially, this is an attempt to increase the information that investors have at their disposal.
Paul, what's your overall economic outlook for the year ahead for the global economy? In the US, we've got a new Fed chairman, Donald Trump's new tax plan coming into effect. In Europe, we've got real Brexit discussions, MiFID II, as we've just discussed. What do you think?
Well, I think the first thing to do is don't get stressed about decimal points. Someone once said economists have decimal points in their forecasts to prove they have a sense of humour. The numbers, the specifics of the numbers are not something to worry about. What we have got, broadly speaking, is a global economy that is operating around about the trend rate of growth. In the US, we've got full employment. In Europe, we've got improving employment. And that's going to sustain the global economy at growth rates, give or take, what they were last year. Inflation may tick up a little bit as we go through this year. As labour markets tighten, wage costs are starting to creep up a little bit, but not in an alarming way, I think. And the other key factor this year, I think, will be that central banks are going to continue to tighten policy. And for the first time in decades, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet will be smaller at the end of this year than it was at the start.
Paul, you're one of several economists who've been talking about an ecological credit crunch that we may well be heading towards. Is that going to impact? Well, first of all, explain what an ecological credit crunch is, and are we heading towards one this year?
Well, in environmental terms, what we are doing is consuming about 1.5 planets worth of resources every single year. So our current standard of living requires us to borrow environmental resources from future generations to maintain the standard of living that we enjoy today. It's a bit like borrowing on credit card for the equivalent of 50% of your household income. Now, clearly, that's not sustainable. And if we run into the point where we can no longer overuse environmental resources, that implies a fairly dramatic drop in our standard of living. The good news is that the world is changing and adapting and trying to become more efficient in how it uses resources. The bad news is that we're already running into problems with environmental constraints on growth. Pollution, for example, in China is reducing life expectancy. Water resources in the Middle East and in many other countries are now actually limiting growth, preventing countries from growing certain sorts of crops, preventing countries from generating electricity. Coal-fired power stations need an awful lot of water to cool them down. So we're already starting to see environmental constraints acting on growth. Not a full-blown credit crunch yet, but it's a warning of what might come if we don't continue to improve our environmental efficiency.
So if it came, an ecological credit crunch, would it be worse than the financial credit crunch that we saw in 2007, 2008?
Absolutely. I mean, a full-scale environmental credit crunch, if we were forced absolutely to live within our environmental means, then you would be talking of a loss of a standard of living between a third and a half. So, if your standard of living was to halve, I think you would probably notice that and feel quite aggrieved. And that is far, far worse than the downturn that followed the global financial crisis of 2008.
Paul, some freestyle thinking here. A lot of people, beginning of the year, continuing to demand change, saying that the only way that the world will change is if we radically rethink the way in which we do things on the planet. For 2018, what would be your dangerous idea?
That's a very interesting question. I think the dangerous idea, which would radically change the global economy, would be to allow far more free movement of labour. To allow people to migrate around the world a lot more. And that has two advantages. Firstly, it leads to more efficient economies overall. And secondly, it probably reduces prejudice. One of the weird things about a lot of the prejudice and discrimination we see is it's conducted by people who aren't exposed to immigration, who don't know foreigners. As soon as you get to know foreigners, you realise they're exactly the same as you are. So my dangerous idea, I think, that would be truly transformative for the world economy would be to liberalise migration flows.
Paul, as always, it's great to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thanks very much indeed.
Finally this week, businesses in the Gaza Strip have long been struggling under an Israeli blockade. Many owners are barely able to keep their operations afloat. Now, a new cartoon hopes to bring their story and struggles to a wider audience. Malcolm Webb reports from Gaza.
A girl called Noor buys an ice cream and wins a ticket to visit a sweet factory. Noor's a fictional character in an animation made by an Israeli rights group. But the factory and its owner, Mohammed Talbani, are real. And so are the many problems operating under the blockade of Gaza by Israel and Egypt. Noor discovers them as Mohammed shows her around, starting with a power cut. Electricity's off most of the time in Gaza. During my visit, Mohammed explained that since the siege began 10 years ago, most of his production lines are closed most of the time. He didn't want to fire any of his 400 staff, their families depend on the wages, so employees had their hours cut instead. And, as the animation also shows, the machinery they use has problems too. Israeli authorities restrict the import of anything they say could be used to make weapons.
The packaging's meant to be done automatically by this machine, but it needs a spare part from Turkey that's not been allowed in. This machine puts the cream filling in biscuits. It needs Turkish technicians to come here and service it. They're not allowed to come. This whole production line's been down for 4 years. Some of the equipment needs to be sent to Germany for servicing, and that's not allowed either.
And Mohammed doesn't believe the restrictions are just for security reasons.
It's the Israeli and it's very liar. This is do it to stop the industrial in the Gaza and to make the people it's very poor. That is the politic of Israel.
Israel's military assaults on Gaza in its conflicts with Hamas haven't helped either. 3 years ago, the factory was hit by an Israeli rocket. Mohammed gifts the sweet factory to Noor, but as she sees its problems, it becomes a story of shattered dreams. The rights group that made it, called Gisha, says it aimed to inform people but also challenge stereotypes.
We wanted to be able to tell the story of movement restrictions on the Gaza Strip and do it in a creative way so that we could attract new audiences and open people's eyes to the fact that there is a different reality inside of the Gaza Strip than the one they normally hear.
Business has also been hurt by Israeli restrictions on exports. Mohammed says trade won't pick up unless the siege ends. At the end of the film, Noor makes everything right with her imagination. In reality, things aren't so simple, and Gaza's industries are still crippled.
Malcolm Webb ending our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, you can tweet me. I'm at @afinnegan on Twitter. Please use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you can drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.